to address it. But before we get started, we have a few quick housekeeping notes. In addition to our audience here, and thank you again for joining us this morning at the Longview Gallery, we are also live streaming on thehill.com and the Hill's Facebook page. So please keep your phones on silent throughout the duration of the program. And as I'm sure you've noticed, this is a very open event space. So if you're down in the reception area, try to keep it to a whisper because it will echo up here. But we do encourage you to be very engaged on the conversation in social media. And you can do that by following us on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, and Instagram at The Hill Events, and join the conversation by using the hashtag #TheHillHomelessness. We will be taking questions from the audience during the program, so please be on the lookout for members of our team with handheld mics, and they'll come up to you and take your questions. And finally, you'll receive an electronic survey at the duration of today's event. So we're always eager how we can be more dynamic and improve, so I encourage you to take a few minutes at the end and submit your feedback. So with that all done and over with, let's dive right in. It's my pleasure to introduce Congressman Danny K. Davis. Mr. Davis has been in Congress for more than 3 decades and represents Illinois' 7th District, which covers downtown Chicago, the west side of the city, and neighborhoods that provide much of the city's public housing. He is also the co-sponsor of Housing for Homeless Youth Act, which seeks to increase affordable housing for homeless youth and veterans. Joining the Congressman Davis on stage is Steve Clemons, the Hill's editor-at-large.
Thank you, Brittany. Good morning, everyone. Might take a seat here, Congressman.
All right.
Let's have fun. I just want to point out, because I'm sort of old school, have a seat.
Thank you.
And I'm going to dance here for a minute. No. First of all, I do also want to thank our underwriter, and I'm not doing this to be nice to the underwriter, but I do want to point out Bill Daley. Such an honor to have you with us, former Chief of Staff, the Obama White House, former Secretary of Commerce. He now happened to be connected to this company behind us, but I hope you guys can help fix this problem we're going to discuss today. So Bill, great to see you in the audience. Today we have, I think, the responsibility to look at every corner of the homeless challenge, and I know you've been working on that quite a bit, Congressman. And I'm interested in just seeing your dashboard. As you look at homelessness, you've done a lot for your citizens in Chicago and trying to move that needle. What is going well and what is not going well in terms of tackling homelessness?
Well, let me just say that in terms of looking at that, first of all, I really want to commend and thank the Hill and Wells Fargo for highlighting this issue and giving all of us an opportunity to look at something that is as critical as what we are experiencing, especially with young people. And so when you think of homelessness, you got to think of at least 3 or 4 different things. Some individuals, just by the experience of birth, start out in a difficult position, not having the stable parenting that is needed. Then there are educational problems and difficulties that they run into. And then there's just the real problem of growing up. Some young people, for example, have difficulty at home and they can't get along at home. And so they find it to their advantage, as they would think, to find another avenue. And so we have that movement. And you can't really be as effective as we need to be unless you address all of the issues that generate the state of homelessness. If you think about 1.5 million homeless people in our country in 1 year, we're not just talking about the young fellow down the street or the young lady who can't get along with her mother. We're talking about a massive number of individuals who are not experiencing just this notion and idea that at the end of every day, I've got some place that I can lay my head, that I can call home. So thank you again for addressing the
Pleased to do it. So let's get real here for a minute. You've been working on this. I know you've got a package of tax policies that you've been trying to usher through and protect the provision of roofs over heads, but looking at it beyond that, looking at the other dimensions of what a healthy community looks like. Tell us some of the things that you've been trying to do to kind of look at a more holistic level of approaching homelessness.
In many instances, you're trying to just find a way to stabilize. For example, my district office is located in an area where there are 2 shelters for 500 individuals, but not for youth individuals, not for young teens, not for individuals who are in their early 20s,
right.
Individuals who, and so while those resources are there, we don't have the kind of resources that we need in terms of youth hostels or homes, group homes, where you could have 15, 20 young people living together in an environment with professional help and with individuals who can make sure that their movement and entree into finding foster parents or into finding stable place or even having the assistance that they need to be in educational programs and institutions that will prepare them as they continue to age up and age out, but hopefully age into a stable living condition where they've got a place to stay.
One of our speakers later is Aldo Hurtado of the Latin American Youth Center here in Washington, D.C., and I know they're dealing with a lot of us as well, so I want to point that out. You've been working with Brad Wenstrup on trying to increase resources across the aisle. We've got a couple of Republican congressmen coming in. How would you grade the literacy of your colleagues on the homeless challenge in both parties?
Well, let me tell you, many of my colleagues are very serious about what they are trying to do and what collectively we are trying to do. And so when you hear of activity like some of the programs in Cincinnati that Representative Wenstrup is a champion for and of, and trying to help make use of those throughout the country, that gives you a sense of hope and a sense of possibility. We all know that changes come far more slowly than we hoped they would. But if you can just get moving, if you can get started, if you can come up with an idea that you can sell to others and get them to buy into it, then every time you make a step, you're getting a little bit closer to the goal. And I think that's what Brad and other people who tackle these problems, I think that's what they really bring to it.
Congressman, is there awareness in Congress, and I would even say the administration, in the kind of legacy of financial institutions, the government, the lines that divided by race in some of our urban cities, and undoing that, and how important it is to do it? I'm asking the racial question because when you look at homelessness and you look at what you just shared of those people being born into certain circumstances, I'm just struck by the fact that many of the initiatives don't look nearly as sizable or consequential as they need to be to deal with the legacy problems.
Well, I think you're exactly correct in your analysis and in the way that you look. Some of our conditions come as a result of just the environmental differences. For example, when I hear people sometimes talk about how great we're doing in terms of employment opportunities, I'll say that's true in some places, but it's not true in other places. And in order to bridge the gap, we've first of all got to make sure that the individuals in all places have opportunity to take advantage of what, for example, we have a HPOD bill, HPOD, Health Opportunity Grant Program, that would provide grant money to help train the most difficult to hire individuals to work in healthcare. Well, that will go a long way towards preparing those individuals to be able to access jobs. One thing about health is that the need for it will never go away. And so you always need individuals to help do what needs to be done. So it's that kind of activity, I think, that really helps to bridge the gap and change some of the discrepancies that exist in our society.
Are there any things that the Trump administration has put forward that you find helpful on the homeless problem?
Well, I think that there are things. It becomes a matter of how do you make implementation of ideas really happen and to work most effectively, as opposed to ideas that make it more difficult. For example, I had a family come into my office the other day, and I really thought they were just going to go off, totally off, because they had had some challenges getting their money that was due them from Social Security, and they're afraid that they're going to lose their home, and that was their big. And part of the problem is that the agency is just behind in terms of processing claims and having enough people to do it. And so there are programmatic things, but in many instances, it's not enough. In many instances, it does not do what you intended for it to do because you didn't put enough resource into it. You cannot get blood out of a turnip. And the reality is no matter how you cut it, slice it, dice it, you're still going to end up with turnip juice. And so you got to put enough resource in to get the results that you're looking for.
You know, we're going to bring another member of Congress up in a moment to join us in this conversation. Run this a little bit like a talk show. But I'm interested in as you think about a community that, as I understand it, you've got about 30% unemployment in your district. Is that about right?
That is correct. In certain parts of my district, it would probably even go up a little bit. In other parts, of course, it's probably even lower. I have a fascinating district. I mean, I go from what we call the Gold Coast to the Soul Coast. and so wealthy end of my district, right, down in the Chicago Loop near North Shore, but then the inner city areas that were devastated by the riots that occurred 50 years ago. Sure. When Dr. King was assassinated.
So just before I bring Congressman Lowenthal up there, do you like him, by the way? Yeah, yeah. We'll have some fun. Well, before we get him up here, just as we look at this audience, I'm amazed by the group of people we have here today. How are you, Alan? Good to see you, sir.
Well, let me put this down.
Alan, how are you doing?
Good to see you. Thank you. Good to see you.
Thank you.
Have a seat. Join us. And as you look at this room, Congressman, and you look at the number of folks that are interested in this subject, I know there's a big hearing going on today as well on the Hill. Morning Edition on NPR, I was told, was all about this question of homelessness. This is, the lightning has struck today. I'm just interested, just what do we not get that you think people need to get? You're talking about 30% unemployment, the rise. When it comes to thinking about a healthy community and putting the building blocks of a healthy community together, what do you want this audience to know from your perspective?
That we need to balance opportunity, and we need to make sure that there are no areas of the country that are not experiencing some of what it takes to make it more competitive with other areas. Democracy is a challenging way of life, and we have to be aware of that, and we have to make it real.
Joining us is Congressman Alan Lowenthal of California. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you. We'll give you a round of applause. We're going to do this as sort of rotating. We've got Congressman Beatty going to join us in a little bit. What we're trying to put on the table today, Congressman, is this question of breaking down what kinds of things help us tackle the homeless challenge and what's not going well. And I'd love to get your dashboard as well. What do you think that we're not doing enough of to tackle this problem in a serious way and make it less endemic?
Well, I'm not sure I'm the expert to say all that. I can tell you that it is endemic in my community. And first is the awareness and the acceptance, and that no one level of government can solve it by itself. There has to be partnerships right now. We're trying to create them in my district because, while we don't have the very high unemployment that we have, the disparity in income. There are really two Americas out there. There's the America that's able to afford the rents, that looks forward to kind of either taking loans out and moving forward in the society. And then there are those that are stuck in the society, whether because of addictions, whether because of other kinds of substance abuse, whether because of a lack of skill, whether because rents have gone up. And in my community, people float in and out of homelessness. Before I came here, I used to run a mentoring program at the Cal State University Long Beach. I taught psychology, and we would have classes where
Probably pretty good for you in the capital.
It's very good to have it in the capital, but it's not working. But and so we would adopt an entire class. And these were kids that were not doing, in high school, not doing that well. Not the worst students who are failing out, not the best. These are the kids that end up getting C's and D's, get through school, but it's not really for them. They don't feel that they're a part of it. And the shocking thing was, in a fairly affluent community, about a quarter of our high school students, after we got to know them, spent time with them, went to their homes, about a quarter of them were homeless, in and out of homelessness. They would, because of domestic violence at home, because of problems, they would end up on their neighbors or their friends' couch for a while. They'd sleep in their car for a while. Sometimes they'd get home for a while. And so I began to think and see, it wasn't just one or two students, that this is a dynamic. People float in and out of homelessness much more than it's not a static situation.
Right.
And so that's what I see in my community a lot. And I see a community that's struggling with it, wants to do the right thing. And it's kind of interesting. There are those in our community that just want to get rid of the problem, not to see it. And there are those that really want to do something about it. But criminalizing homelessness no longer works. You just can't do that, although many communities have tried to criminalize it.
What do you both think? I'll pose this to both of you. Think the president is seeing or raising when he attacks California for homelessness? And when you look at the data do show that the homeless challenge is greater, I hate to divide this way, but blue states versus red states, or areas that supported Trump versus not. What's going on there?
Well, you're talking about urban versus rural America. You're not talking about blue states
But there
necessarily.
are big cities in red states.
And they have homeless issues also.
And I think those comments coming from the president or any place else are not helpful. As a matter of fact, they are divisive. They raise the notion that these differences are going to keep existing, that there isn't much that's going to take place to do something about them. And I think it's unfortunate when we hear that.
And we're trying. It's not as if, it's one thing to blame people who are walking away from the problem. It's another thing to blame people who are out on the streets trying to solve the problem, and they don't have either the resources or the kind of coordinated approach, enough shelter beds to get people off the streets. People just want them off the streets, but where else are they going to go unless the city? And then you have, how do you move people along? How do you deal with the multitude of problems? How do you get people into permanent housing when many of our land owners or the apartment owners don't want to rent to Section 8. They don't want to rent to government because we have such a shortage of housing anyway. They don't have to do that now. Because housing has gone up so much in price. you would think it'd be to their advantage, but we still have a significant number of folks that do it. And we're a community that has struggled, for 20, 25 years, Long Beach, California, we have a homeless, a multi-service center. We took our naval housing and created 1,500 permanent beds that we have over the last 10 years, beds that are both for transition, for permanent supportive housing, and also for shelter beds. We're trying to get more shelter beds now, we acknowledge it, but this is a problem that seems to be outpacing our resources, and that's why I think we need to work together. Every level of government, it has to be identified as, and not, as Danny said, not blaming places, but to realize that we do need better models, and this is tough. These are very difficult problems that we're facing.
Rob, before we thank you and send you back to your good work on the Hill, when you look at the real estate industry, you look at housing throughout the United States,
yes,
and you look at where the tax policy is there something not aligned? Is there some way to tweak taxes or incentives to make it something where low-income housing is not a lag effect behind the rest, but there's actually enthusiasm and rigor behind providing low-income housing?
Absolutely, and I don't think that a lot of it is only the negative perception. Right. There just aren't enough. Right. But, and also we're at a point in our community where we're kind of built out, and so we kind of understand that we have to increase density. We have to increase density along our transit corridors. We have to provide for affordable housing along those transit corridors, and mixed use.
Right. Congressman?
Well, I think we try to be as creative as we can be, especially those of us working on the Ways and Means Committee and trying to make use of tax policy to deal effectively with issues and problems. I mean, we find that people relate a bit differently to tax credits than they do to finding direct resources to put into an arena. And so tax credits and the utilization of those to deal effectively or as effectively as you can becomes a big way of doing it. Like the earned income tax credit is one of the best weapons I think that we have.
Which I know you're trying to get kicking in younger than 25 years of age.
That is correct. And to make greater use of it for individuals who are low income, at the bottom of the barrel, and can use all of the help we can provide for them.
So, Alan, we're going to keep you here. Congressman, I want to thank you so much for being. Danny K. Davis, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. Good seeing you. Okay.
And I want to call to the stage Congresswoman Joyce Beatty. Joyce, thank you so much for being with us.
Yeah,
good to see you. Thank you. Now we're going to have some more fun. I really did enjoy, I didn't mention this with Congressman Davis, when I asked him what he does for fun, and he said, I read. And I realized how rare that is. I really appreciate that. Keep reading the Hill. But thank you for joining us. We started this morning really having kind of a discussion on the structural dimensions of homelessness and what needles can be moved or should be moved that are not being so. And so I'd like to start out with you. I mean, there are a lot of dimensions to this. I don't think they're silver bullets, but you have a responsibility up there to kind of both of you to sort of help look at how do you marshal resources and national will on a topic that normally it's getting a ton of attention this week, but normally doesn't get the attention it deserves.
Absolutely. First, let me thank you and welcome Kyle aboard to the Hill, and certainly to Bill Bradley and all of those for being a sponsor. It is getting a lot of attention now, and while that's great news, it's also unfortunate because this is not a new topic or a new issue. Anytime you find that you have some 550-some thousand people on any single night finding themselves homeless. And when you think about the number of children and families, this should be on the forefront until we at least move the needle a little more. So to your question, when you think of all of those barriers, all of those things, whether it is poverty, whether it is mental health, whether it is or underemployed, whether it is discrimination, then we have to look at all of those and move the needle, as well as funding. And earlier, I think it was Alan that talked about the lack of resources that we put into it. As you probably know, I serve on the Housing Subcommittee on Financial Services. I have a long history and background of not only advocating but legislating in this area. I think it was very important for me to look at children, for example, the Family Unification Program. We put got $20 million some dollars put in that, more than had been put in that since 2010. So we have to go back and work together. We have to tackle poverty. We have to look at the discrimination. You know, I can remember redlining when you didn't have an opportunity. And I'm glad Danny mentioned reading, and we do read a lot. Not to give a plug, but Evicted.
Do give a plug. Is that your book?
No, I wish. Now,
Yeah.
we heard it here on the Hill. No, but it's
By Matthew
Desmond, who's going to be here
Evicted, right,
today.
yeah.
Another topic later, Senator Sherrod Brown from the great state of Ohio is looking at the issues around this. So today is a big day for us on the Hill, talking about homelessness.
You know, one of the debates out there, Alan, is whether or not you should precondition the provision of housing or a roof over the head. You know, my colleagues titled this today, The Right to a Roof. Is there a right to a roof?
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
And do you believe, I mean, I think it's one of the things that's going to come up several times in discussion with some of the folks there. Do the trend of at least the Trump administration is, you know, work mandates, other kinds of mandates as a precursor to some degree on the provision of housing for those that don't have it?
Let me just say this about the whole thing of housing. Let's put it in simple terms. Think about a young person getting up, operative word, right to a roof over your head. How do you perform in school? How do you perform in daily life if you're worrying about where you're going to go to bed that night, which usually means where you're going to have something to eat the next morning? So I think it is imperative for us as legislators, and not only us, I think it's imperative of us, the audience, us, the community. This is not something that can be resolved by members of Congress only. We all need to participate in this to be able to help fix it at the city level, at the county level. You know, mayors and governors, those who are out there as activists, we all have to come together because there's a part for all of us to play.
You know, I was reading your Twitter feed, and I love your Twitter feed. I love both of you. Both of you are very erudite, smart, witty Twitter feeds. But you made this comment recently that 4.08 million Ohioans have pre-existing conditions, and I think it feeds into somewhat today
Absolutely.
the economic fragility, the health the fragility of things, if you will.
Absolutely.
And I want to give you an opportunity. If you can move two or three elements to make the country and your citizens less fragile, what would they be?
Oh, I think without a doubt, poverty, healthcare, the environment, and economics. You know, because if I'm not healthy, it's going to be difficult for me to maintain a job, to go to school, to function as we all do.
Right.
If I'm worried about how am I going to pay my rent, my mortgage, or buy food for myself or my children, or worried about if I'm going to be evicted. So I don't think you can do these things in isolation. And I think last thing I think we have to also look at, we still have far too many disparities. Too many African Americans and other minorities, too many women are left out there. When you look at it, women are still making less on a dollar than their white male counterparts. When we look at the number of African American boys and children who are incarcerated. So there's so many things that feed into this that we have to be very strategic to take a look at this. And thank you for bringing this up today.
Alan?
You know, I want to get back to what you said about, you know, the present administration says, well, really, let's just get people back to work, job, just put it into job. And there's no doubt that jobs are going to help. There's that. But when you look at that, really, you take this very large issue that's going on in all our communities, and you end up blaming the victim, an individual approach. You're saying the way you fix it, if you follow me, is just to fix individuals out there that aren't fitting into the system. That's really what they're saying. They're not fitting in, they're not renting apartments, they're not buying, so there's something wrong with those individuals. When in fact, what we're looking at is this society is not a society that builds in systems that everybody succeeds. Some people succeed, some don't. Whether, as Joyce said, whether it's because of discrimination, whether it's because of abuse, whether it's because of poverty, everybody doesn't have the same opportunity to fit into the system. And so what we have to look at is to step back and figure out how are we going to do a better job of including everyone into the system, not blaming those that are not fitting in as though there's something necessarily, even though they may have tremendous needs, as we all do, but to blame them for this really hides the problem that we have some very important forces. One, we have things where minimum wage is so low. In my community, you can't get housing if you're on minimum wage.
Oh, absolutely.
You can't. It's impossible. Unless you work 2-3 jobs.
I mean, it's a staggering number of Americans who make $18,000 a year.
Do you blame those people for where they are? Or
And even in the Midwest, on that point, $15 an hour won't cut it. You need at least $18.70 to be able to live in what's an affordable for those individuals. But here's another thing, supply and demand. If I look right in the 3rd Congressional District, right in the heartland of Ohio, when we look at it, we have a wait list for Section 8 of some 26,000 people. So when you think of, we don't have enough venues or facilities also to house those, and we have the lack of affordable places to live.
I just asked them for 4 more minutes, so thank you very much. I appreciate that. What's that? Oh, his mic? Oh, your mic is falling, Alan. So,
my mic is
falling. Yeah, there you go. I want to ask each of you a last question. And thank you so much. I mean, I feel this is rich. I feel like I'd like to spend a couple of hours with you each. I think everybody would stay for that.
We will come back.
Yeah, that'd be great. But Alan, let me read something to you first that I took off of your Twitter. It was very, it was a very powerful statement. I know that bipartisanship, which is part of what we're trying to do today, is important to you. And I'm interested in how you maintain bipartisanship, how you think of it on this topic. But you wrote, President Trump has acted impulsively without any strategy, planning, or sound advice over and over. Often he has been motivated by his personal interests, not his duty to protect the country. He can't be trusted. Congress will assert its power and restore sanity. That was from you directly, not a retweet. And so I'm interested in that environment with what you shared. What is possible in a bipartisan sense on some of these issues?
Well, there's no doubt that we're now operating under a very toxic situation in Congress, and so maybe as a psychologist, whether it's addiction or when we have such toxicity, you realize that at some point we're going to reach bottom and then begin to have to come together and to figure it. I don't think that the present administration understands that we're now in a race to the bottom in terms of these social issues. We need to really touch the humanity of all of us, the compassion of what we want for a society, and that's a bipartisan way. People come from, I chair a little different. I chair the subcommittee on energy and mineral resources on the Natural Resources Committee, and I'm very much concerned about that's all federal lands, offshore and onshore energy development. And I am convinced that we have to move from, which we have now, 95% of our energy production is fossil fuel on federal lands, 5% is renewable. And I want to change that formula to 95% renewable and 5%. So I spent some time with members of my committee, one from southern Louisiana. I went to visit the district, spent time, I joined a bipartisan kind of a group, a Republican, who is out there, and he's right, to defend his community. Those are the jobs that they have. If it wasn't for oil and gas in
Right.
Louisiana, there would not be any other jobs. And I needed to go down and understand that. That does not mean that we still do not need to protect this planet and
Right.
move forward. I'm not, but it doesn't help to blame him because he takes another position when he's trying to, just as we're trying to protect his community.
Sure.
We need to figure out how we listen better and we don't vilify each other because we
Thank
come
you.
from different
Thank
points
you.
of view.
Joyce, let me ask you a question, finally, to give you the final word here before we move on, and I'm so sorry that we don't have more time because these are so important. You're chair of the Diversity and Inclusion
Yes.
Subcommittee, and I think that one of the things we have been working on this is to understand what that means within the homeless problem, within inequality. And it seems to me that diversity and inclusion is often pursued casually. It's sort of like an add-on, you know, people think about versus how do you really move this into a much more healthy place. And so what are your insights in this committee, share with you? What does this audience need to hear about making diversity and inclusion real in tackling some of these issues?
Let me say thank you. And what we've been able to do, because we are moving the needle, when you look at, we have brought every president and CEO, we started at the top, of the largest banks in this country, and they all showed up. And the question is not us dictating to them or checking the box, but for us to say, you tell us how you're moving the needle, because you understand when you don't have, when you lack diversity or when you're not inclusive. And we started at the top. We said, let's take a look at your board. Who's on your board? Because if we're in the room, if you put a diverse group of individuals beyond race and ethnicity and gender. So if you have younger folks, if you have veterans, if you have rural folks, if you have a democracy within your board, it makes a difference. And that's the same way I look at homelessness. If we're all engaged, if you just take the social service entities and say, that's your problem, and you don't take the funding, and if you don't take the diversity of the issue, then it won't move. But if you demand the people at the top, i.e. as to housing, the Secretary of Housing, challenging, making them aware, sending them letters like I've been able to do. In corporate America, I can tell you the needle is moving. People are responding. They had to respond to a report. Now, it also helps that we have subpoena power. Yeah. But people are
That's a whole
very
nother
much
show.
responding.
We've got Congressman Lee Zeldin and Rod Davis about to join us, so I want to thank you both so much for being here. Congressman Joyce Beatty, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Congressman Alan Lowenthal, thank you for helping us guide
Thank
this.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll get evicted.
Evicted.
Another quick round of
Thank you.
applause for our members of Congress. Thank you again for joining us today and for your insights. Now, please join me in welcoming on stage Representatives Lee Zeldin and Rodney Davis. Congressman Zeldin represents New York's 1st District and sits on the Financial Services Committee. Congressman Davis represents the 13th District of Illinois, which covers both the urban and rural areas of central and southwestern Illinois. Both lawmakers have pushed for funding to help homelessness assistance programs, and they will be joined today by the Hill's editor-in-chief, Bob Cusack.
Thanks, Brittany. Thanks for joining us, Congressman. Congressman Davis, I want to start with you. Big, broad question, tough one. The economy, by many standards, whether it's the stock market, the unemployment rate's the lowest in 50 years, but yet homelessness in this country is still a major, major problem. Why is that, and what can policymakers do about it?
Well, I think what Lee and I and the other members of Congress who run before us can talk about is where we've had bipartisan success when it comes to policy changes that we think we should make in Washington. But it doesn't negate the fact, and as you clearly stated, it hasn't reduced homelessness in certain areas. There are certain areas of the country where homelessness is affecting its population more so than places like where I live in a small rural community in Illinois. I think a lot of it has to do with housing prices. You know, at some point, you're going to, if you're unemployed or if you're in a certain sector, or if you're you're fighting opioid addiction, if you're fighting mental illness, it's going to be tough to find a place to be able to live affordably. And I think we're seeing that in some of the larger communities where housing stock and housing stock prices have continued to rise. It's one issue that we as Congress can't solve without taking a local, state, and federal combined partnership approach. I think when we look ahead, we've got to figure out a way to get people into programs, into training, so that they can take advantage of this growing economy and this historic low unemployment. It doesn't seem to work when it comes to homelessness as well as it has been when it comes to the rest of the population, where you've seen millions come off of government benefit programs and finally get into the workforce and see their wages continue to grow.
Congressman Zeldin, a big issue within the homelessness problem is veteran homelessness. You've worked on that. You made that a top priority. Your background is in the military. Can you describe what you've been working on and how bipartisan has it been?
Well, first off, thank you for having Rodney and I. I think it's amazing, the great turnout. A lot of people here passionate about tackling the homeless issue. I represent a district in Suffolk County, New York. We have the highest veterans population of any county in New York State. It's the second highest of any veterans population of anywhere in the country. You have an issue with regards to veterans homelessness where some people need access to certain programs. The federal government helps out, for example, with SSVF, supportive services for veterans families. For veteran families, and SSVF has been reauthorized to 2021. It's something that I believe should be permanently extended. The HUD-VASH program is something too. That voucher program also helps to put roofs over the heads of our veterans. We have to have also local flexibility and breaking down barriers so that there's access to affordable housing. So where I am in Suffolk County, we've seen more housing projects come up to be able to put a roof over the head, not just of that homeless veteran, but also that low income veteran. They do have some funds they can afford to pay to help put a roof over their head, but maybe they don't make enough for the cost of living on average where we live in Suffolk County. Self-sufficiency is something that's an ultimate goal. You want to see upward mobility. People want help, but ultimately, especially when you talk about a veteran, they want independence. They want a job. They want to be able to support their family. For some veterans, it's access to services to combat the heroin opioid abuse epidemic. For others, it might be mental health services, access to peer-to-peer support. For one veteran, it might be the ability to have a dog. For someone else, it might be training a horse. For someone else, it might be fly fishing. It's amazing with the veterans how many other ways you can help that veteran clear their head, move on, become more self-sufficient, independent of just going to your local VA and getting medicated out of whatever condition it is that you're going through. Last thing I would say is this. If you're a member of Congress and you happen to take a trip, for example, to the VA center in Los Angeles, and you travel around the block and you see veterans sleeping on the streets outside of the VA medical center, if that doesn't break your heart, if that doesn't motivate you to want to do something about it, then you should just get out of Congress and let someone else take your job who would have that experience and be deeply emotional about it and motivated to do something about it. So the veteran homelessness issue is not just close to my heart. I also believe it's something that is solvable, and where we've seen the most progress has been where that local community, with the help, different levels of government working together, but that local community deciding, you know what, we are going to totally solve veterans homelessness in our town, in our county, in our city. And I'll tell you what, every single time you see that commitment, people get serious about it, 100% of the time they solve it, and you see the veteran homelessness number go down to zero in that particular location when folks have their heads squared on the right way to solve it.
You mentioned the peer-to-peer. How do veterans find out about that? Through the VA program? Is that it? Is a lot of it telling people these programs exist?
For one of the biggest issues, if you're not in New York State, almost all of the other states, the biggest issue is there isn't a good peer-to-peer support model. In almost every other county in the United States of America, if you need peer support, you don't have access to something that would work. In New York State, we started it in 2012 with 4 counties. It's expanded to about 24 counties. If you live in Suffolk, you contact the Suffolk County Veteran Service Agency. They will connect you with the person who runs the Joseph Dwyer peer-to-peer support program for the county of Suffolk. They'll let you know where the closest meeting location is to where you live. You'll go into that setting. You'll be at a table with other veterans going through some of the same symptoms that you're going through, some of the same struggles, because one of the biggest issues for veterans in need is that they feel isolated and alone. Their family, their friends, people at work don't understand what it is they're going through. They don't know how to talk to them about it. They don't know how to talk to them through it. So in Suffolk County, this model that puts you with other veterans with a trained peer-to-peer support mentor can give you that assistance you need in that setting, but also give you access to other services that are needed. Maybe it's connecting with a VSO. Maybe it is connecting with the Northport VA Medical Center. Maybe they're not registered. Maybe they can get a roof over their head and they don't realize how. Maybe there's someone else who has access to be able to get a roof over their head, but for some reason, they're making the decision to instead live on the street. You can't really have a one-size-fits-all solution to this. Not every veteran is the same, not by a long shot. But if you have a setting where all the options are available and you make sure that that veteran knows about everything that's available, you can make progress and you can cure that for almost every single veteran that's out there. Every time we lose a veteran due to the mental wounds of war, I think it's a failure on the part of the community, the county, that local government, that local veterans community, the people who want to help, because they don't realize that at 3 o'clock in the morning, there's someone who lives around the block from them, who's a stranger, who would drop everything to come over to save that veteran in need. But they don't have that access, and that's a big issue. So the problem, I would say, outside of New York, is that we need to get more of our state capitals talking about peer-to-peer support. It's a minor investment. Get this, $200,000 for the county of Suffolk. $200,000, we launched a full-blown peer-to-peer support program that involved thousands of veterans. $200,000. So it doesn't take a lot of money. Sometimes when you have an issue and people throw money at the problem and it doesn't solve anything, you could put $10 million to a particular county and solve nothing. You just need the right people, the right passion, dedicating their services, dedicating their time, maybe their venues, their food, their expertise, and the problem can get solved. But it doesn't cost a lot of money to solve it.
Congressman Davis, homelessness, everyone in this audience will probably see a homeless person today. So it's a problem we see every day, especially here in DC. There's no homeless political action committee. The homeless problem doesn't get a lot of headlines on cable news. You mentioned federal-state coordination. What do you see that could be improved there? Because there have been debates about whether this is a federal problem, whether it's a state problem, but it's a problem that seems to need a comprehensive solution.
You know, Bob, it really does. To piggyback a little bit on what Lee talked about, it's got to be good communication. You know, we here in Washington, and this isn't just part of a homelessness solution, but it's any issue we deal with at the federal level. Any issue we deal with at the federal level, we can come together and we can invest hundreds of millions of dollars, billions in some cases, and we here in Washington can sit back then and go, well, we fixed it, but we don't know how those dollars are being implemented. We don't know what the communication inconsistencies may be between the federal agency that's tasked with distributing those dollars to our state and our local communities. And that's why it's so important to have that partnership. And I really trust that the administration is working on plans when it comes to homelessness to help coordinate that communication better. Because Lee said it right. We can invest millions of dollars to solve a problem when it may not take millions of dollars. And then what happens is if Suffolk County can do something for $200 grand, then that saves money to help somewhere in Orange County, California, or Sangamon County, Springfield, Illinois. You know, can you hear me now?
Just repeat everything you said.
I hope you don't want me to repeat all of that. We only have 4 minutes left. The bottom line is we got to have better communication. You know, we here in Washington will come together in a bipartisan way. We'll solve problems. and that we've passed the most historic and significant investments in solving the mental health crisis in a decade, just a couple of years ago. We've done the same thing with opioid addiction. We've invested hundreds of millions of dollars and put policies in place that were asked for by locals. But we don't know how they're working until we go talk to the people on the ground. The same issue with homelessness. I think we in Washington need to do a better job of following the money that we send down to our local communities. I don't think we do that well enough, because then we can correct some problems. Then we know who's actually using the investment wisely, and then we know if the problem's actually solved. Because too many times, my district, I can go in certain parts of my district and you won't see anybody laying on the streets homeless. But then you can go to other parts of my district that are mini urban areas and you'll see somebody sleeping in the entryway of the local newspaper. Springfield, Illinois, I mentioned. They've locally decided this year to use local funds to help address the homeless problem that they have that is nowhere near the scale as it is in some other communities. But you got to recognize it. You can't ignore it. And we can't just continue to do the same thing we've done, because clearly, as you said here today, if all of you saw somebody homeless today, it ain't working as well as it should.
Congressman Zeldin, when you look and you dive in some of these numbers, and they're staggering, specifically on race. 13% of the U.S. population is African American. 40% of the homeless population is African American. Why is that, and what can Washington's / state local efforts do about that?
Well, earlier I referenced upward mobility, and what does the American dream look like? It's hard to just jump straight up to achieving everything that any one person defines as the American dream, but it starts with having a roof over your head, shoes on your feet, food on your table. If you don't even have that, it's impossible to achieve the American dream in full. Now, my grandparents were married for over 70 years. If they lost everything, if they had no home, no food, if they were living in a cardboard box in front of what used to be their house, as long as they had each other, they had one of those marriages where they would have been totally happy. There are people who are in all different income levels throughout our country who are happy with their life. But for someone who doesn't even have a roof over their head, shoes on their feet, or food on the table, it's hard to achieve even that. And I think that's key number one, making sure that they have the ability to get out of that. And you have millions of available jobs in our country right now, but a skills gap to be able to fill those jobs. You have some people who want to work right now but can't find employment. And yet where I am, you could get $60,000, $70,000, $80,000 a year jobs at certain places in my district where you don't even need to go to a trade school in order to qualify for those jobs. So it kind of depends on where you are and what type of opportunities exist. I know how to answer that question for anyone who's struggling in the 1st Congressional District in Suffolk County, but that might not be the same answer as Joyce Beatty and Alan Lowenthal and Rodney Davis and others that you'll hear from. In our own districts, you need to have localized solutions. But where I'm from, the answers is connecting folks with the opportunities that exist. For some people, it's getting access to certain mental health that they need. For others, they're struggling with the heroin and opioid abuse epidemic. That's a big deal. By the way, regardless of race, gender, socioeconomic status, anything, where we're from, it's really plaguing everyone. The opportunities exist where we are, regardless of who you are, whatever your background is, to be able to give you help. But you have to make sure once you get that help that you don't get stuck in that position, that you have the tools that you need in order to be able to move out of it and be able to achieve the American dream. And I believe where we're from in Suffolk County on the east end of Long Island, that you have the ability not only to get that roof over your head, but to be able to get that job, to get that skills training, to be able to move up, to be able to own a home, to be able to have a family, and to be able to feel independent and to achieve that American dream. That path exists where we're at, but there are other locations where people are really struggling as a locality to be able to have that system in place, that access, that help, all the tools that they need in order to get through that path of upward mobility. I think geographically, that a lot of your answer is based off of not just America as a whole, but specifically where that person is and what opportunities are available where they live.
We've run out of time. Please thank the Congressman for joining us this afternoon. I hand it back to Brittany.
Thank you again, Congressman and Bob. Up next, we'll be hearing from the administration. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Robert G. Marbut, Jr. He's the Executive Director of the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness, the agency tasked with coordinating and catalyzing the federal response to homelessness. Prior to leading USICH, Dr. Marbut was the founding president and CEO of Haven for Hope, a homeless shelter in San Antonio, Texas. Joining him on stage is Jamal Simmons, the host of Why You Should Care with Hill TV. So Jamal, the floor is yours.
Morning. Good morning, everybody. All right. I wish I could say it's nice to see you, but I got bright lights in my face, so I can only kind of see your silhouettes. I just sit here. Is this not on yet? Okay. I don't need a microphone. All right. So I want to thank you all for having me here, and I want to thank you for being here. Dr. Marbut, you are new at the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness usage, right? Let's just start with a scene-setting question. Do you see the homeless as victims, criminals, or a nuisance problem that has to be corrected?
None of those.
Okay. How do you see the homeless?
I see it's very important not to think of homelessness as a monolithic. And we have two sets of data, and we keep forgetting about one set of data. We have the Department of Education data, the students, the youth, the K through 12, PK, and then you sort of have the HUD numbers. And one of the congressmen was really great. He said, make sure you don't look at it monolithically, because there's 5 or 6, 7 triggers. You have divorce economics. You have post-traumatic stress. You have military sexual trauma, which is probably one of the bigger growing areas. You have domestic violence. You have mental health, behavioral health. You have substance orders and such. And so if we start by saying you have a monolithic one side, then that means a one-size-fits-all model is going to work. Mm-hmm. But if you realize you have subgroups that have different sort of catalytic events that got you into homelessness, that will direct and guide you in a really different approach on how do you address it.
So as policymakers, are you interested more in who's your client? Is your client the homeless person and family that's in front of you? Is your client the business owners who are nearby and they feel a certain sort of way? Are they taxpayers who are also in the city? Who do you see as the client population that you're supposed to be solving a problem for?
To me, it's the individuals and family experiencing the condition of homelessness. Because if you focus there and get real graduation off the streets, that's how you solve all those other problems. If you start with those other problems, you're going to get some really crazy ideas too. I mean, crazy can go both sides.
Right.
It can't just always be one side. So you want to make sure that your focus is the families and the individuals experiencing the homelessness condition.
All right. So you've been on the job how many weeks?
19 days.
19 days. So welcome to Washington. It's a great place.
And 2 weeks of that was during the holidays. So.
So tell me about your plan for your new role.
Well, first off, I think we have to have an honest conversation about the numbers and what I call scope, scale, and structure. Because if you don't truly understand the scope, scale, and structure, you're going to end up with a really addressing the wrong issues. Peter Drucker used to talk a lot about what gets measured gets done, and if we measure the wrong thing, we're going to do the wrong thing. And so let's actually walk through some of the big numbers. When you look at from 2007 to 2014 and look at the unsheltered number from HUD, that number dropped 31.4%. So we were on a glide scale, and that's not an annual number, that's over the time. We were dropping street level, chronic level, as HUD measures it, the unsheltered percent. And then in 2014, it steadily goes up to 2019, 20.5%. So we were going down at 30%, and then we took an inflection point, and we've gone up 20%, 20.5.
When was the inflection point?
2013, 2014. Okay. And so you have to stop and ask what changed there, because that's a 50-point differential on a derivative. If you get into calculus, that's a 50-point derivative, a little more than that. So something significantly happened in that time frame to change it. Additionally, when you take let me hit one more number. One more number, because we haven't even gotten to the children's numbers yet, so in the youth and education numbers. If you add all of street level unsheltered, take the HUD unsheltered number and add all the assistance beds up, from 2014 to 2019, that jumps 15% too. And so, so if you have a 15.6% of your overall people experiencing homelessness, and then you have a 20.5% increase, when this number was going down, something happens. So there are two big things that happen at that time frame. One is we moved away from services merged with housing together, affordable housing. We basically steadily took away services and said we're focusing only on the roof. They're both important. The roof and housing is very important, but so is trauma-informed recovery would be the new term. Back then that term wasn't really out there. And so
you're getting at something that sounds like a debate that's happening between housing first and housing fourth, which is what you're credited with. So
which I never said, but a reporter quoted me as quoting somebody else, but not me.
Okay, so let's take the concept though. Do you see yourself, where do you see housing fitting into the priority area for the homeless?
To me, and I've been in this world working in communities that has actually reduced homelessness. And at Haven for Hope, we have placed 13,000 people in permanent supportive or market rate type of housing, long-term sustainable housing. And what I have learned that really works, instead of talking about slogans and such, what really works is when you take trauma-informed care, and you could say trauma-informed care, trauma-informed recovery, trauma-informed treatment. They're, depending on what agency you talk to, they'll use those terms interchangeably. And then match it with affordable housing, you get sustainable housing. And that's what the goal should be, because if we get there.
Well, what's the priority though?
They have to be together. It's not one or the other, it's both. That's the problem of 2014. So I think we have to analyze why we have a 50% derivative change. So let me go through those real quick. One is, that's also the marked point where we moved from transitional housing to rapid rehousing, which is a very aggressive form of housing first. It basically says we're going to do everything to get you in a house right away. And along the way, we forgot the issues of whatever that unique catalytic trigger was that you have. And you need to address that or you lose the house a second time or a third time. Mm-hmm. I want to focus on sustainability and stability. Now, the other thing is, and it's really important because this is real, you got to follow the money. The continuum of care has changed. We used to have a continuum of care that was 1/3 emergency, 1/3 transitional, and 1/3 permanent supporting. The way HUD funding is moved, it has moved very much to this side, and you almost have zero in the emergency inventory. There's a few left. You have transitional dropped to about 40% of what it was. The other is, we used to honor local knowledge and let local continuum of cares decide what's best. Because what I've learned in life is what you need in Wyoming, what you need in Lewisburg, Florida, and what you need in LA are very different. But that's not what we're doing. We're saying one size fits all, top down.
What you need for a single man or what you need for it's also different.
Yeah, totally, but that's not what we're doing. Most of the money that has been moving to a one size fits all model rather than honoring the local uniquenesses that need to be done.
Okay. So there are people who are critics of your approach. Former Housing Secretary Julian Castro is one of them. When you were appointed, there were 75 members of Congress who had something to say that wasn't very complimentary about that appointment. How do you plan to do your work in a political environment where there seems to be some resistance to your approach?
I think the most important thing is sitting down with the people, and I would love to sit down with all 75. I've reached out. We're starting that process, and I want to talk to them all. And I also want to show numbers.
I asked if I could bring the presentation and put this one slide up, but I was told we don't do slides at this event. And so I think when you look at this and say something went wrong we got off the rails in 2014. We were going down. I mean, people before had figured this out and it was working. And so why did we make this change? Why did we get off the rails? And I think we should have an honest conversation. First look at data, then move to the policy.
All right, what about security for some of the folks? And you brought up Haven of Hope. One of the questions about that project was that it wasn't necessarily very secure for many of the people who were at one of the big compounds where they were being kept or housed. How do you address security when you're thinking about relocating people away from urban centers and putting them into a group environment?
Well, in that case, Haven for Hope, 4 of the acres of Haven for Hope is actually in the Central Business District. It wasn't moved out. And most of the people who write that, I always say, have you actually been there? Have you actually toured?
I have not been there.
And so I always ask, go there. And what we know is, we know how many people were dying on the street before. Dying in the street. I mean, we have major urban pockets that we have 1,000 people dying in one city. We have 100. We have several cities where 100 people are dying in it. And San Antonio was one of those. And we know our death rate has dropped dramatically. And so we also know we're putting people in housing at a rate that never had happened before. Austin and San Antonio in about 2005 basically had the same mix. It's not exactly, but it was pretty close. And now you look at the total difference. Look at the number of people who are going into and have recovered and gotten a long-term supportive housing. We placed way more in San Antonio than we Austin, and we took totally different approaches.
All right, I think we have time for 1 or 2 questions. Anybody in the room have anything they want to jump into? Sir, I can see you right there in the back of the center.
Bill Cunningham, Creative Investment Research. Right.
Sorry, can you stand up again and say your name?
There have been a number of legislative efforts out of the House Financial Services Committee. Maxine Waters and Representative Beatty have introduced a lot of legislation around this issue. What's your viewpoint on that? Is that helpful? Are you planning additional legislative initiatives? How does that work? Thank you.
I think what we got to do is tweak back to what was working. And what we knew was working is when you matched housing and wraparound and permanent supportive housing together, and you put those services together, the unlinking of them has been unproductive. If we just focus solely on the roof, and without torturing a metaphor, it'd be like going to a hospital without doctors and nurses. And so we have to be able to have that together. Now, some people may need a light touch, very little case management, maybe virtually none other than getting in place. And there are other people and other families who need a full-blown package. And so we need to do that. Now, on the affordable housing side, I was hearing the congressmen and women talking earlier. If you really want to get serious about affordable housing, we have to back the truck up and get very serious about affordable construction. If you don't get affordable construction, you're never going to get affordable housing. It just will not happen. And so you have to look at some of the states that have, because of Amazon and transportation, the cost of that door in continental United States is going to be virtually the same price wherever you move. The hourly construction rates will differ, but even when you adjust for, Honolulu is a different thing. Honolulu has a real unique situation going on, and that's one of the cities that is really gripped by this crisis. But in continental United States, building materials are virtually the same wherever you go now. And if you adjust for the hourly rate, you still can't explain why some of the states have construction that are 200% over the rest of the United States. And so if we don't get really honest about what is driving up those construction costs, it's folly. And so we need to talk about what really will drop construction costs. And what I know will do, if you're a local community and you're serious about it, waive all fees. Literally, if a local community wants to to get serious, waive every single fee in it. Make a one-stop shop truly a one-stop shop. Bring everybody together and give them their homework assignment. Make sure they have all the materials. And some communities have done this around the country where as many as 80% can get through in a day. And get all your homework done, have all your forms, lay it out, put it out, and then come and get serious. Have an appointment set up. Don't have a drop-in. Come in at 8 in the morning, and we'll work all your approvals in one day, not multi-day that's going. And
before we get a chance, we're going to get out of here in a second. I want to give you a chance to make some news. You going to do a deal with LA?
We're optimistic. No, I'm serious. This is and if anybody watched the tweets that was going on, and I'm spending most of my time on that, there's a whole team of people that are working it in the mayor's office, also the supervisor's office and with the administration, and we're very optimistic. And if that is and the reason why some people have asked why LA, well, that's where, if you look at the numbers, that's where the challenges are. And I couldn't have agreed more with the congressman who was up earlier, said, this is not going to get solved with one level of government. This is going to get solved with the federal government, working with the local government, but we also have to change some of the stuff we're doing, because you look at this inflection point and it just doesn't make sense.
All right. Thank you very much. Good to
Thank
see
you.
All right.
Thank you very much.
Good luck to you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you again to Robert and Jamal. And if any of you have not had a chance to take a peek at Jamal's show on Hill TV, it's the Hill's video platform. Please do so. His show is excellent. So now it's time for the portion of the program produced by our underwriters, Wells Fargo. So please join me in welcoming on stage Julia Moran Morton, the Chief Housing Development Officer at So Others Might Eat, and Brandy McHale, the Head of Corporate Philanthropy at Wells Fargo. Brandy, the floor is yours.
Hello. Good morning, and good morning. Welcome, Julia. Thank you for joining us. So, as a financial institution, we are an important source of capital for financing that production and increasing the supply of housing that we've heard about this morning is such a critical piece of the solution process. But we also have made a philanthropic commitment to invest $1 billion over a 6-year period to support change agents working in local communities, change agents such as yourself, who have been at this for almost a quarter of a century, both developing housing and really looking at economic opportunity pathways. So let's just step back for one moment, and let's talk about making sure we have some common language. We talk about this as the challenge of homelessness, as a lack of affordability, as the crisis of gentrification. Are these all the same thing?
Well, Brandy, they're all interlinked. I mean, and ultimately they are tied to the lack of affordable housing. I mean, the reality is for extremely low income folks who make below 30% of the area median income, for 100 of them, there are only 37 affordable units available. So it's a scarcity. But whatever label you put on it, whether it's a barrier to employment or housing because of a disability or addiction or discrimination, creating a barrier to employment or housing, or inexperience for someone who's just out of school, trying to get a job. It's about their buying power in the market and the lack of the supply for the affordable housing there. Or if you're one of the 11 million urge waiters in our country that is paying more than 50% of your income for rent. They're just one paycheck away from being on the streets or doubling up in overcrowded or inadequate conditions. There's a myriad of reasons why people end up there. And it's that lowest income level, below 30%, that So Others Might Eat focuses on. Because at the end of the day, if the housing's not available and it's coupled with services to address the root causes, services that affect the social determinants of health, like mental health, medical health, and job training to allow people to move forward, that's it in a nutshell.
So, I think it's one of the aha moments in philanthropy was a recognition that these issues aren't separated. You can't solve these issues in silos. That as human beings, all of these issues are interconnected, and we need to stop doing our work in silos. We need to not think that we can increase the supply of affordable housing on one side, but not address what's happening to the families that are living in that housing when they have that opportunity. So that aha moment, though, also complicates the solutions. It's not a silver bullet. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach. And so if you're in an organization on the front lines, what does this mean for the work that you do? So tell us a little bit about, so others may eat, and your approach.
Sure. 50 years ago, some began by handing out sandwiches to the homeless on the street. And it quickly evolved into noticing that there are other needs. Some of the Congress folks mentioned it, but there's a Maslow's hierarchy of needs. If you can't get beyond food and drink and clothing and a roof over your head, how can you progress to other stages of life? So some started out, then opened a soup kitchen, then noticed people needed clothing and medical and dental and housing, and has quickly evolved into doing comprehensive integrative services such as at our Conway Center, which provides both housing, medical, all of the integrated services to approach it. So some has grown organically and evolved into this, but the real determinants are to address all of the root needs and provide the housing. We're 7 million units short in this country for the extremely low income population. And we need to find creative ways to increase the production of the housing and to preserve the affordable housing that we already have, because we're losing it at alarming rates, either because the rents are increasing or the housing stock is dilapidated and we're raising those buildings and building market rate housing. So we need to couple the different ways to produce more housing and to provide those support services to allow people to overcome those barriers.
I'm going to ask you a question that might be a little unfair. So you have a lot of experience. You work with a lot of organizations in this region. I know you've worked with the Coalition of Neighborhood Housing Developers. You work with a lot of affordable housing groups. Think you'll ever see success that allows you to put yourself out of business?
It would be great to be able to put ourselves out of business, but the reality is that we're always going to have people who are on the brink, who are falling through the cracks. I mean, right now you could earn a living wage, you could make minimum wage, and you'd have to work 90 hours to afford a unit. It's about, there's always going to be a disparity that we need to try to decrease that disparity. We're always going to need to build housing we have people out here with degrees, social workers and others who have graduate degrees who aren't able to afford a home. So we need subsidized housing. And subsidized housing is not a bad thing. For those of us who own a home, we're subsidized every time we write our taxes and write off our interest on our taxes. And that's to the tune of $28 billion from the federal government. We need to continue to put resources to close that gap and support quality housing for folks in need.
So give us some advice. We've launched our new philanthropic initiative. A big piece of our commitment to being an innovative grant maker is coming into this space and recognizing we don't have all the answers, but we want to work with individuals who have the experience and the track record and don't shy away from innovation. So give us some advice if we want to invest in innovation, how to approach this. What's some ideas you may have?
Well, one of the things I didn't touch upon is some has different forms of housing. Not everyone's looking to buy a home, to buy a single family home. We need products that create alternative affordable ways of living. We have SROs, single room occupancy, where we have individual rooms and folks share a kitchen, sometimes individual rooms with a kitchenette, and they share baths or vice versa. Different creative ways to design co-living that creates affordability. On the financing end, if you have the tax credit, low-income housing tax credit and bond financing is really what is the driving force for affordable housing these days. That doesn't cover it completely, but we need to keep those strong. We need to add low-interest products to the stack, we call it. There's multiple levels of funding in low-income housing affordable development. Low-income housing, low-interest loans, such as Low-Income Support Collaborative provides, if we can get the banks into that game, that helps us keep our debt service low so that we're not having to highly subsidize over the course of time. And grants, such as Enterprise and Wells Fargo just rolled out a grant program, and other organizations that can provide grants to close that gap will decrease the ongoing operational funds we need for subsidies on an ongoing basis. So it's not new. It's all of the components are there. It's complicated, but each one is a simple thing we can address with all of the resources we have in this country. And we thank all the banks for pitching in and creating affordability.
Well, I want to return that thanks actually back to you and just say, in my experience, it's not just innovative ideas, but innovators who can stay the course. And change agents such as yourself are really, I think, a key. We can have, we need policy, but we also need people on the front line. So thank you for the work you do day in and day out.
Thank you, Brandy. Thank you.
Thank you again, Brandy and Julia and Wells Fargo, for all that you do in this space. Now, please join me in welcoming a person who homelessness was not just a policy issue or a topic of academic interest. Mark Thompson, a veteran, spent 20 years in the woods, moving between Maryland and Virginia and barely making ends meet. Today, he has a roof over his head and the support services that he needs. The organization that helped Mark find stable housing is Pathways to Housing DC. Christy Respris, the organization's executive director, is also joining us. Steve Clemens is back to lead the conversation. So over to you, Steve.
Thank you so much, Brittany. Thank you both for being here. And I just feel, I want to start with you, Mark. Give us a little bit of insight into why this topic is one that you wanted to be here for this morning.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Mark, and I'm a homeless veteran. I was homeless for 30 years, and I lived deep in the woods where nobody would come. But the only downside to that was I had to deal with the creatures. And at night, possums would come in and hide and wait till I ate and come and take my food. And then the raccoons would come. You know how raccoons got them little black things around their eyes? They're like burglars. We shine a flashlight like burglars, and they would just take my stuff. It'd been one or two, it'd be 5 or 6. Towards the end of my homelessness.
Keep going. I'm going to go shut down the other room over here that should not be speaking. So
towards the end of my homelessness, I hated my life. I hated the air that I breathed. I used to curse God every morning because I woke up. I just wanted to die. I had 4 daughters I hadn't seen in 20 years. I had 5 grandchildren. I didn't know how they looked. I would go to bed in despair. I cursed God every morning. And then I met these beautiful people from Pathways to Housing. Changed my life. God is awesome. And today, I no longer curse God. Once I open my eyes, I say, I'm up, oh Lord, thank you. I have a beautiful relationship with my kids. My grandkids love to go fishing. I have an SUV. I live in development now where I live with lawyers and doctors and nurses and federal police. I come out in the morning, drink my coffee. They say, good morning, sir. I say, good morning, how are you? Absolutely beautiful. And I just thank God for Pathways because what they did was no matter what my issue was, they got me into an apartment first. Once I got into my apartment, then they helped me deal with my other issues, my mental health issue. I thank God for the VA hospital because they gave me treatment for 2 years with my mental health problems. They told me about the cycles and how I get into cycles and how I progress into a downward spiral. I praise God for them. And I just praise God that, let me tell you, I weighed 127 pounds when I came into this program. I hadn't taken a bath in 9 months. I hadn't changed my clothes in 6. I was filthy. But today, hallelujah, I weigh 180 pounds. My family, I have 12 brothers and sisters. They don't even know who I am when they see me. They don't even know who I am when they see me today. I am a product of God's mercy and His transforming power. I'm a product also of what Pathways do. This is what Pathways do, and I love them. Thank you.
Mark, before I go to Christy, thank you so much for sharing that. It's very powerful. I was at Union Station the other day, and I saw people there that haven't yet made the jump you have. What is the most important thing from your perspective about creating the confidence, the trust, the relationship with people that don't have that roof yet to get them to trust? You had to trust the process. You had to trust even getting the roof on your head, because I'm just wondering what you think we need to hear about that person that hasn't yet gone over the line like
Politics and statistics and a lot of that stuff I don't know about. All I know is this. I wanted to die. I didn't care about my life. I just wanted to die because of the despair. I just couldn't handle the despair. But they have an outreach program. They was out looking for veterans. And she was calling out, veterans, are you homeless? I can help you. And I heard her. So a lot of people out here just don't know. They just don't know where their help is at. And there's not a whole lot of outreach. So I praise God for the outreach program because I happened to hear it one day. And that's how I got the help.
And I'm going to ask my colleagues to go ask our friends in the reception area to be quiet and be respectful of these folks on stage. All right? Or I'm going to go do it. Christy, I've been looking at the rate of homelessness in D.C., which is, if the data, Mark said, I know, but if the data are right, it's a staggering drop. Like there's a massive shift in Washington, D.C., and I'm interested in what is going on there.
It's a good question. I think what's going on is incredible coordination and partnerships between the private sector and the public sector. You know, when Pathways to Housing, we brought the Housing First model to the district in 2004, and there was a fair amount of concern and a little bit of resistance. People was new. People were worried. Were we setting people up to fail? Would it work? But people saw the success, and the district government decided to invest in the Housing First model, put the resources towards adding not just the housing, but also the support services, and requiring people to move towards the Housing First model. So what's happening in the district, I think, is that deep coordination. We have an incredibly high-functioning interagency council on homelessness, where we're bringing together, again, private, public, government. And I think that's really the key to this, because we can't just wish it away or hope it'll get better. It takes a lot of intensive work, and that's what's happening in the district.
So on this issue of Housing First, which Mark just said why it was so important, it enabled him to get a place and then to begin dealing with other issues. What do you think the opponents of that view need to hear? Christy?
So I think they don't really need to hear a lot. Just look at the research. It's been researched over and over and over again. We know that it works. So look at the research. But I think most importantly, and the reason that Pathways even started the Housing First model was that we didn't come up with this idea. We listened to the people who are experiencing homelessness themselves. We work for them. We asked them, how can we help? What's the solution? And they told us the solution, it's housing. So
Mark,
research, but listen to people.
Cool. Mark, is there anything about the program you would change or improve?
They need more space and more employees to keep doing what they're doing. I mean, it's just an awesome program. And I know there's many more people, because I've made a lot of mistakes in my life. I made bad choices, hanging out with the peers, getting high, foolishness. I'm a 6-year Army vet, so I know how to survive, but if there just could be more funding and more where they can just go out and get more. Because I know so many more that want another chance. So many more who want to be with their children and their loved ones. I know so many more out there that's in despair, that's in pain, that's hurting, and they need to be scooped up before it's too late.
What are the other dimensions, Mark? Once you get a house, once you've got there, now you've told me that you've got an SUV, you're working, and you're kind of putting all these pieces together. And I am interested in it. You know, we've been discussing, inclusion. We've been discussing some of the divisions that have been part of the society. I'm just interested in getting your perspective on what are the other barriers out there you think we need to see knocked down.
Again, I'm not a complicated person. I have a cat. You know what my cat name is? Cat. If I had a dog, guess what her name be? Dog. So I just want to say this. When I met the young lady from the outreach program in Pathways, man, the level of compassion she showed me. And the way she was so concerned about me, it ignited my spirit. And when my spirit got ignited, guess what? I got momentum. So we just need more compassion out here because people just seem that they just do not care about each other. And the way we treat each other out here today is just outrageous. It's sad. It's really sad.
Thank you for that. Christy, are there cities that are copying what you've successfully done here?
Well, what I'm most proud of in terms of pathways and the legacy is that this is the norm now in most communities. I think there are very few communities who are not engaged in some kind of housing first, but the work still needs to be done. It's not just the practice around the country, but the best practice now around the world. So again, I think we need to spend more time, now that we've been doing it so long, drilling down to see, okay, what's going to help even for that small percentage of people, the next kind of iteration for whom it's people are still struggling in housing first, but we know it works. Really, we just need to continue backing this model through HUD, through local communities, et cetera.
In a later panel here, we've got Mark Jones, who was telling me they've been doing a lot on Seattle. Aldo Hurtado here at the Latin American Youth Center here in Washington, dealing with all sorts of programs with Latino youth. Laura Zeilinger from the city of DC on Department of Human Services. So you've got these are the non-federal people. They're all either city or operating in environments that don't necessarily have to work with the federal folks that we had in here earlier. Does the Fed help or does it hurt what you're trying to do?
So the feds, it's a critical portion of what we do. So at Pathways, we currently have 607 people in our Housing First program, all in apartments all over the city. Half of our funding is federal, half. Half is a local investment, which is, I think, very unique in DC. What other communities to learn from is that the federal government is not going to end it all. We need the federal investment, though, is critical. So when I see disinvestments or fears or talk of disinvesting, it's impossible to do this work without that investment. I mean, Mr. Thompson here is a recipient of the HUD-VASH program, right? We can't just invest in veterans. We need to invest in veterans and all of our citizens, and the federal government has a key role to play.
Mark, just finally, and final thought from you on the place you live now and what you would like this audience to most know about how to help other people to get to a place like you're in today.
It's a simple Bible scripture to love one another. We need compassion out there today. People just do not care. They'll walk by you like it's nothing. And again, I'm just so grateful for the outreach program and Pathways because I just happened to hear somebody calling out for veterans, and we just need more compassion out here today. And if I could just say one more thing, if I could just tell you the favorite part of my apartment is...
Say two.
Okay. As much as I like to get up in the morning and fix me some pancakes and scrambled eggs, and much as I like to have fresh linen on my bed or get a bag of chips and watch the football game, you know what I like most about my apartment? The light switch. Woo! It was dark out there in those woods, and I'm so grateful that I can get up and turn the light switch on. Hallelujah.
Ladies and gentlemen, Mark Thompson, Christy Rich-Press, thank you both so much for giving us some insight into this. Thank you.
God bless you, brother.
Thank you again, Mark, Christy, and Steve. We're doing some housekeeping up here and some interior design. I'm not sure if you knew that Hill offered those services, but we do. So race, mental illness, drug addiction, foreclosures, unexpected medical bills, and underemployment are all playing a part into the homelessness crisis that has gripped our country. Beyond the nationwide shortage of affordable housing, how can homelessness be adequately addressed and remedied? What policy approaches should cities and federal leaders prioritize, and how are private sectors and advocacy organizations assisting struggling Americans in their transition to housing security? So it's time to hear from the experts. For the final segment of this morning's program, please join me in welcoming on stage, hold your applause stand please, because we have a great group of experts. First is Nan Roman, President and CEO of the National Alliance to End Homelessness. The Alliance is a national nonprofit and nonpartisan organization that seeks to achieve its mission through research, federal policy, and capacity building. Thank you for joining us. Mark Donis, Executive Director of the National Innovation Service. Mark is a social entrepreneur, policy strategist and social justice activist with 10-plus years of experience in equitable systems transformations across local, state, and federal governmental systems. Jill Kadori, Principal Associate at Apt Associates, a social science research firm and co-principal investor of HUD's annual Homelessness Assessment Report to Congress, which was actually released last week. She is also the co-author of a book that will be released next month called In the Midst of Plenty, Homelessness and What to Do About It. You've been quite busy lately. Laura Zeilinger, Director of the DC Department of Human Services, Under her leadership, the department launched a prevention program and other reforms that led to a 40% decrease in family homelessness between 2016 and 2018, while maintaining year-round access to shelters. Thank you. Aldo Hurtado, Director of Housing, Latin American Youth Center. Aldo also has 20 years of experience working with runaway and homeless youth and children in foster care. He is also trained in trauma treatment counselor. Joining our panelists on stage is Rafael Bernard, a staff writer with The Hill. Rafael, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So we have a packed panel here, talent, experience, knowledge. This should be good. Mark, I'm going to start with you. The statistic came out. About 40% of homeless people are African American. We use, for a lot of these social issues, we use disproportionately affects this community, disproportionately affects that community. It seems that homelessness is very disproportionately affecting the African American community. What's behind this?
Thanks. So, briefly, I used to run a project called SPARK, Supporting Partnerships for Anti-Racist Communities, that was the first national study on race and homelessness. And one of the things that we found, actually two main things that we found, one is just to your point, right? Like most folks experiencing homelessness are Black, brown, or Native. The second thing that we found is that when you look at disproportionality as the measure, right, what you tend to see as the floor for disproportionality is a rate of 3, meaning that if I go to any community and say, what's the general population of Black folks here, right, I can multiply it by 3, and I will get close to what the population experiencing homelessness is, right? I say floor because there are communities where that is worse, right? But generally speaking, that tends to give me like, okay, like I know what I'm going to be working with. What we found as one of the core drivers, one is just, I should say, right, historical and structural racism is a thing. And if we don't name that, if we don't say, like, this is the result of racism, then we do all this nonsense about other stuff, and that actually isn't effective, right? If we are not laser focused on fixing structural racism in America, most of our social problems will not be fixed, full stop. The second thing that I will say, is that in that study we found something that we characterized as network impoverishment. And what that means is that when we looked at folks, particularly Black and Native folks who were experiencing homelessness, right, what we tended to find was that there was a high level of interdependence, right, but not enough capital to actually wrap around that interdependence. Meaning, right, that if I am short on rent one month, right, like I might call you and say like, hey, can you help me out with $200 to meet my rent, right? And you may have that. What we found is that in Black communities, right, that is not the case, right? And so what you see is that even if folks are making more money than, say, their white counterparts experiencing homelessness, the difference is that for those white folks, they may have 20% left over in their budget that is unallocated, versus for Black and brown folks, what we found is like every dollar in is a dollar out. And so there can be no margin of error, right? If I blow a tire, that's it.
Jill, I want to ask you, does this research, does what we're talking about here, has this permeated up to the policymakers? Or to some policymakers and some others not so much?
Actually, we've been doing, am I mic'd?
Yeah.
Okay. I've been doing research on homelessness, and my colleagues have been doing research on homelessness for a lot of years. I've been at it for 20 years. And what I found is that research really has tended to make something of a difference. To take an example, I mean, we heard Dr. Margaret say earlier that It's not a good thing that the amount of transitional housing has gone down. That move away from transitional housing was firmly based on a lot of research that shows that putting people into housing first really is the right thing to do. That research had a lot of influence. So yes, I think research does matter. I would also say that, this is, may seem simple-minded, but the solution to homelessness really is housing. And there's a great deal of research that supports that.
It seems sort of like the obvious answer, and you've given me an opening to get into our favorite thing, which is politics. I'm looking at you, Laura. I almost want to just have you respond to Dr. Marvin's claim that what changed in 2014. He basically claimed that the change in 2014 was a policy-based change that backfired. I'm paraphrasing, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
How would you, having been in that part of that policy change, how would you respond?
So I would say that there are a few things. One is that I think, generally speaking, rather than be overly divisive, it's important to also recognize there's some commonality around the way that we think about it. I think there's generally what I also heard Dr. Marmot saying, that housing plus services are really important. And housing first actually is housing plus services. It's not just a roof and nothing else. It actually brings the supportive services, but it doesn't make the offer of housing conditional based on participation in services or other things that other leaseholders generally don't have to do in order to live in a house or rent an apartment and so forth. So I would say we know that permanent supportive housing is the solution to chronic homelessness, and housing is the solution to homelessness. That has been true, and if we look at where we have made progress, because we have, look at the veteran homelessness has been an issue that is bipartisan. Everybody believes that I've met that nobody should risk their life and oftentimes come home maimed, and because of their service to their country to protect our freedoms, to live on our streets or in shelters and be unsafe. And because of that, we have seen federal investment in the housing and solutions that have worked to drive down nationally homelessness among veterans, shifting in the VA from a a recovery model to a housing first model. And so we know what works. We've seen what works. And I think, and we need to keep doing what works. And that is making housing available and the services. The other thing I would say is we also need to look at the macroeconomic factors. Homelessness is not because somebody did something wrong and they're ill. It's exactly what Mark Jones was speaking about, which is that people are living in poverty. There's very little margin of error. And for economic reasons, they're becoming homeless. Well, housing since 2014 has only gotten more expensive, and wages have done very little, except in just a few communities, to increase to keep up with the price of housing. So you cannot decouple any, the situation of homelessness from the economics of what does it mean to balance a budget and afford housing in our communities, particularly in high-cost markets like California. And in the District of Columbia, where we have reduced homelessness every single year with the right investments in the solutions that we know work.
Well, one thing that caught my attention this morning is there has been this talk of housing as the primary issue, which seems obvious, but also this idea that homelessness is more multifactorial than almost any issue I can imagine. Then you've talked about sort of getting housing solutions to the federal level, getting I don't know if out of cities, but at least plus into the federal level. How would that work? How would that interact with all the issues that have come up, veteran homelessness, race, substance abuse? Like, what would be the role of the federal government in your vision?
Well, as the other panelists have said, people are homeless because they don't have a home, and when they have a home, they're not homeless anymore. But they still have other needs, that's for certain. Sometimes they have very light needs, just need to get back reconnected, or they're already working. Many homeless people are already working. Some of them are not, many of them are not, and they need higher incomes and so forth. The federal, but right now, as various panels have said today, the economics just aren't working essentially, and low-income people simply don't make enough money to pay for the housing that's out there. So what could the federal government do? Well, first of all, it could provide housing vouchers to people who qualify for them by income. Only 1 out of every 4 households that qualifies for housing assistance receives it because there's not enough. That's one thing. If you subsidize people's housing, you'd have to increase the supply of housing. So the federal government could invest more in the Housing Trust Fund and the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit and other kinds of programs that result in an increased supply of affordable housing. And then in addition, there are a lot of people who really can't afford their housing, again, as panelists have described, but if they get a flat tire and they can't take their car to work for a week, then they all of a sudden can't afford their rent that month. They just need a few $100 to make that up and make the rent. The federal government could have a flexible pool of funds that would help stabilize people in housing that could afford their rents. I will just also say, though, that there is a big local responsibility as well around affordable housing, and that we've lost a lot of affordable housing in cities because of decisions that are made at the local and state level as well as the federal level to keep that supply. So everybody needs to be involved in increasing the supply of housing.
Before we go hyper-local, and I'm going to go to you, Aldo, on the hyper-local, Jill, I have a question for you, Jill. There's been a lot of different attempts to solve the housing issue. You went through the 60s building big, then you went through the gentrification period, if you want to, raising all that. Have any of those programs actually worked? Is there something that we've abandoned that we ought to take a second look at?
Well, we haven't abandoned it, but it's just as Nan said, there's not enough of it. We need at least twice as many housing vouchers, Section 8 housing vouchers, as we have. We don't need to.
Put your mic closer.
Mic closer to your mouth.
Closer to your mouth. Oh, closer. Yeah, we need about twice as many Section 8 vouchers as we have. We don't need to do it all at once. We just need to return to the era when we were adding 100,000 vouchers a year. And that would alleviate some of the problems with people languishing on waiting lists for long periods of time that were mentioned by the Congresswoman this morning. It is a workable program. Not everybody who gets a voucher is able to use it, but most people are. We did a study in which it was an experiment in which we randomly placed a bunch of families who had been in shelters for at least a week. These were quite high needs families. More than 90% of them succeeded in using the vouchers that they were given access to.
So I want to shift into, Aldo, into the effects of homelessness, what it's like for the population that is homeless. So you work with homeless youth in DC.
Right.
I understand a very diverse community. Tell us a little bit about the diversity. And what is unique about minors who are exposed to or part of homelessness?
Oh wow, those are several questions, and I think that this conversation has been high-level conversation so far. So let me tell you a little bit about the Latin American Youth Center and the work that we do for homeless youth. We have been around for around 52 years. We have offices in Washington, D.C., Montgomery County, and Prince George's County. We serve around 5,000 youth per year. 42% of those youth are African American, and 46% are Latino. We provide a wide array of services, including housing. We have 12 housing programs right now, and we divide them into family-based programs and transitional living programs. Our family-based programs work very much like the foster care program. We recruit families from the community who are willing and able to take in a homeless youth, and we place them with them for approximately 18 months. Our transitional living programs are scattered site apartments, and we place young people there with services and supervision. At any given time, at any given day, we have a capacity to serve 77 youth. Last year, we served 136 youth. And of those who exited our housing programs, actually 67% exited to what we call positive permanency. In essence, that means that either they were reunified with their families or they are now living independently. In addition to that, we have a drop-in center that is open from 7 to 7, and homeless young people come in and they eat breakfast, they take showers, they rest if they have been on the street all night, they get ready for school, and they get connected with services. Last year we served 599 young people through that program, and 22% of those people were connected with safe housing. I think that there was another question, and I forget. I think that you asked the difference.
Well, I think a little bit about what the experience is like, and I think you're talking about this right now. What the services you provide affect that experience. What would you say is your success rate with the youth that come through the?
So as of
program?
last year, our success rate was 67%. 67% of the young people that we work with actually exit to positive permanency. We work very closely with families. Go ahead.
At a qualitative level, like you see these kids coming through, how many of them do you have high hopes for in the future?
My hope is 100%.
Of course.
But the reality is that we cannot. There are some young people who come with such complex challenges that oftentimes it's difficult to help them, especially with given the length of time that we are allotted to provide the service that they need.
So, Mark, I've read that you were working with King County, Seattle, and you saw inspiration in different parts. Inspiration, maybe a strong word. You tell me. From different cities, you were looking at LA, Portland, Columbus. How much can cities learn from each other in the way that they manage homelessness?
A lot. I would say, if we're free to call ghosts into the room, right? That like in the previous conversation, Dr. Marva talked a lot about like the lack of locality. I work in communities across the country and have not seen him. I'm curious which localities, and I want to name that, right? Because this administration has had a tendency to invoke the local while driving incredibly top-down solutions that local leaders are like, this doesn't work, right? And I want us to name the thing we see. So I think that like one of the things that I see a lot in communities, right, is a lack of understanding about actually how flexible they can be, right? So when we talk about sort of how the HUD dollars have been redesigned over the last couple of years, they actually have been redesigned to incentivize flexibility, right? Like the way that the COC NOFA is structured is to say come together as your community, right? And make decisions about what works. That's the policy. When we work with communities, often what we find is that people actually think that they don't have that much flexibility. They're like, we could never reorganize this, or we could never provide this thing. And that's habit, right? As opposed to actual policy, actual regulation. And so I think that there's a lot that communities could do to come together and actually say okay, what is real here versus what could we learn from each other? What could we take on? I will also say, frankly, the most inspiring thing to me in communities is always when folks who have experienced or are experiencing homelessness lead, full stop, right? The people who know what needs to be done are the people who are experiencing the thing, right? It is the proximity to the problem that always yields insight, not distance. And so when I am inspired in community, it's because, as we saw in King County, right, there was a genuine and full-throated and had a lot of follow-through, right, with saying, let's get people experiencing the thing to tell us what they need, and let's just do that.
Right. So this blame game between federal and local, that has been incentivized by President Trump and his conflict with LA specifically, and apparently conflict resolution with LA, if we're to believe those stories. Jill, you've looked at the history of HUD. Is this business as usual, or is this really different?
Well, I mean, homelessness arose really in the late 70s, early 80s, and the reason was that was the onset of what we now talk about as the affordable housing crisis. And so HUD started working. Congress passed the McKinney Act, and it got implemented, and we've had some successes in reducing homelessness. It is down from when we started collecting the data in 2007. There were 650,000 or something like that then, and now there are 570,000 people experiencing homelessness. As Laura said, our biggest success has been with veterans. We've halved veterans' homelessness. Now, why have we done that? It's because of fairly generous funding for the Veteran Supportive Housing Program for veterans with disabilities, along with short-term rent subsidies for other veterans. And the VA also has a very clever screening program in which veterans who come for medical services are given a short set of questions about their housing stability. So, we feel all, and the local efforts to end veteran homelessness should not be ignored. The communities, somebody mentioned those earlier, the communities that have pledged themselves to end veteran homelessness largely have done that.
We're going to have time for a couple of audience questions, so start thinking about your questions. I'm going to go, Laura, this might be again with the politics of it and the current events. We've all heard about the city removing homeless tents from the bridges in Noma. Are painful, I hesitate to call them solutions, are painful acts like these sometimes necessary in dealing with an issue as complicated as homelessness?
So that is an extremely complicated issue, and some of the challenge, particularly with the bridges in Noma, is that people are in tents that are blocking the entire sidewalk, and pedestrians need to walk in the street, in a fairly busy street, in order to make it from one way to the other, on the side of that. And so our offer is always for services and alternatives. To Mark's point, we have invited the folks who are staying there to come in and talk with us about what they need in order to avail themselves of other solutions, which is critical. So it's not only that people need to move, but people need to understand the alternatives, and they also need to understand that in community, it is not blocking an entire sidewalk, so people have to walk in the street is also not acceptable. But that is one small piece in terms of overall efforts on homelessness.
Was this a measure of last resort for the city?
So the city regularly will go in and clean up encampments, and what that means is not clean people out, but will literally, when people have to live in public space, there's a need to come in and actually throw away trash, clean for public health reasons. It also is sometimes important to disrupt the status quo. People who have spent a lot of time on the street sometimes forget that they feel forgotten, and that something else, and lose faith that something else is possible. And so disrupting that and building conversation, consistent offers of housing, not giving up and continuing to come back is an essential component. We are not arresting people for staying there. We are asking them to just not block the sidewalk, but also avail themselves of the services and supports so that they can have homes in our community. But it is absolutely challenging, and it's a balance of interests that we've pretty much made everybody unhappy, the people who would like to see folks gone altogether, and the people who would like to not be disrupted in that way. And so it is, there's nothing easy about it, but the solution in terms of access to housing with fewer barriers is clear.
We do have time.
Hi, my name is Dr. My name is Dr. Kat Schreier, Water Citizen Media, as a media entrepreneur. Without adequate insurance, I found myself a couple of years ago fighting a battle for my own health with cancer, and spent 10 months in 2 different Salvation Army programs where there were conditions on living in the shelter of having to work chores, having to get rolling minimum wage jobs, being told that I had to get a full-time job, and then learning that I would lose my health care by having a full-time job. Yeah. So I had to cut back on work before getting my cancer surgery, and I was told by the Salvation Army if they'd known I had cancer, they never would have let me in. Okay. We have programs for veterans. We have programs for women who have been sexually trafficked. We have programs for people who have all sorts of conditions, but we have absolutely no place to live for people who are fighting treatable health issues, and thank God they got the cancer out. But Section 8 was not an issue. I mean, that was not an option, because that only kicks in after you've had cancer for 6 months and yada, yada, yada. So how do
we value your experience, but we need to get to the question.
Yeah, well, I'd like to know, what are we doing we have people who don't have adequate insurance, don't have a place, how do we bridge that gap where you don't have to choose between housing and getting treatment for treatable, curable ailments so you can get on with your life and get back on your feet? Yeah.
Very important question. Who wants to take it?
Well, I would just say it's definitely true. There's a big intersection between healthcare and housing issues, and unsheltered people in particular, and this is not exactly what you were describing, but have very severe health problems. Half of people who are unsheltered, which is 30% of the homeless population, is unsheltered, doesn't even have a shelter bed. And half of them became homeless because of physical illnesses. They're 25 more, unsheltered people are 25 times more likely to be trimorbid, that is to have physical health, mental health, and substance abuse problems, as sheltered people. And 80% of unsheltered women are trimorbid. So we have a lot of work to do. People do need housing to address their health issues, and obviously people also need health care and insurance. And these are both things that the government should be providing to everybody who needs them.
We're going to take one more, but it's got to be really short because we're literally out of time. Right here at the front.
Thank you. I just wanted to mention one more solution I hadn't heard today and ask your opinions about that. I do take issue when I hear that you've reduced homelessness in DC because they've moved to Prince George's County. So when I hear that, that's a concern for me. But as far as a solution, I was wondering about the churches. I work with the Milton Matthews Foundation for the Homeless, and there's a church in all communities. There's churches in all communities. And I was wondering, why can't money be allocated to churches to do this work in the community to help? If one church got one homeless person and took them through the process, we could eradicate homelessness, but money needs to go to the church or the organizations, the smaller organizations, because they're the ones who really are helping, building relationships with homeless
That's a valuable
people.
question. I think, Mark, you want to take it. Civil society and religious organizations, what role can they play?
So I think that the, I have an answer to a question with a question, which is like when we say like the church will take a person through the process, what is the process? Because the Salvation Army is a faith-based organization, right? So there are a number of frankly regularity issues in terms of like so for the work that I do, right, routinely I'm trying to figure out, okay, so for the Black church, for example, right, in community, how do we restore some of those institutions, because they did really important community work. There was, they are in the sort of the policy language, housing first, et cetera, right? But that is not the case across religious institutions. And so the question of, how do we interact with the faith sector, right? I think it's a question of, do we agree that there are some common tenets about like what we will consider to be acceptable? And for the civil society, right, we're saying housing first. We're saying there should not be a requirement to engage in work, to do these things, right, that sometimes folks are like legitimately not able to do, that risk health, risk other concerns. And inside certain faith-based organizations, I'm not speaking to anything that you have done, obviously, but inside certain faith-based organizations, that is not held to be the way to move forward. And so the issue there is that before we start distributing federal funding en masse to those kinds of institutions, I frankly would say we need some assurance, right, that like this is going to proceed in a way that we all agree on.
Is it going to be less than 15 seconds?
So I'd just like to say that,
Sorry.
yes, that in the District of Columbia, we've more than 5,000 adults and 4,600 families have moved from homelessness to permanent housing in our community in the District of Columbia. The number of shelter beds that we offer in DC outpaces at least 10 to 1 availability of shelter in Prince George's County, and we regularly see people come across borders. So rather than make this a jurisdictional, you're pushing gentrification is the issue we need to solve, and that, I think, looking at how can we agree in our community to not push people out but have inclusive programs is part of this solution. So I would just encourage that type of more constructive conversation as to who's getting pushed and pulled where, but how do we collectively meet the needs of our members of our community?
I wish we could go on all day with this panel, but please give them a hand. That's all the time we have.
Thank you to our panelists and everyone for joining us here today. Unfortunately, this brings us to the end of our program. On behalf of everyone at the Hill and our underwriter, Wells Fargo, thank you for joining us this morning and for all that tuned into the live stream. If you missed any portion of today's discussion, the full event video will be available on thehill.com shortly. We encourage everyone to keep the conversation going. Thanks. Have a good day. What are you going to do? Thanks.